So one of the basic laws, first laws of economics is something called opportunity cost. That may sound complicated, but it's actually a fairly simple concept that we work with every day. Opportunity cost is the, I define it as the foregone alternatives of a given action. In more of an example, it's if you spent time, money, or resources on one thing, the opportunity cost is what is given up to spend money on those things. Now, that can be an element of human choice, but it also has to do with taxes. We don't know what people would have done with that money had it not been taxed from them, either through direct tax, through debt, which is a tax on the future, or through inflation, which is a tax through meddling with the money supply, printing more money, government spending it first, and then devaluing the currency because you've just printed more money into the economy. No extra value has been added. This also applies to wars, not just strictly in economic terms, but also in terms of life, in terms of time. And let me ask another question before I get into this article that I want to talk about a little bit with regard to specifically the Afghanistan war, but also American foreign policy and war in general. What could you do with an extra $23,000? Think about what you might do if you had an extra $23,000 over the last 2 decades, or about $1,300 extra a year. You probably could have found a way to use that. Save it, invest it, spend it, buy things, offset costs of whatever it is you choose to buy with it. And that's what this article is really about. There's this quote here from James Madison from the 10th Amendment Center. It says, "Armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of a few." And James Madison wasn't being told, oh, well, we've got to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over here, which if you watch my episode on blowback or episode on why suicide terrorism, it's the fighting them over there that causes them being over here. That's what the greatest predictor of suicide terrorism and things like that are. But anyway, no one was calling Madison most likely a dove or weak because of this view of suspicion of handing over government more power during wartime and more money and debt and increasing taxes. But notice here, see if I can highlight. So according to a study of the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs at Brown University, since 2001, America's wars have cost 5.6 trillion with a T dollars. $5.6 trillion. That equates to $23,000 per taxpayer. So what this means is that over the past 2 decades of America's wars, namely Iraq, Afghanistan, but also many others that you may or may not have heard of, have cost about $23,000. Now I've used this 5.6 trillion, and I thought that was just the Afghanistan war. I may have been mistaken on that. But this is even more than the Pentagon estimate, which is 1.5 trillion. And this is a huge amount of money. This is not even fathomable by the human mind. After we hit certain numbers, we can't even think in those terms of what that would look like. But $23,000 over the last few years. The opportunity cost of that is whatever the American taxpayer would have used that money for, saving it, investing it. I mean, what would an investment grow to if it were invested, if $23,000 total were invested carefully over the last 20 years? That could pay for college in many cases. That could pay bills. And even more chilling than this is the opportunity cost of lives, the opportunity cost of time, the opportunity cost of resources. So these things all apply here. And so the war costs are much larger than even the Pentagon uh, estimated because they weren't taking into account. They were just looking at the official numbers of the study, but they weren't taking that. They're just looking at the initial costs, but not all that goes with it. And a lot of things were left out of that. So, just in terms of cost, if the American people had it put to them in terms of cost benefit analysis, which policies are never put to us in this way, it's would you like a park? Do you think the government should be more actively involved in environmental policy to protect the environment? Do you believe poor people should be helped with some type of welfare benefit? It's always, do you believe this or that? It's never put in terms of cost benefit analysis, which is quite a different question. Notice this number here, 1352.94. Cost benefit analysis would ask the question like this, not to mention the other issues of interventionism, war, regime change, civilian death, death of the American and injury and of those in the American military, uh, all these type of things. But if Americans were asked simply in financial cost benefit analysis terms for what has been achieved in Afghanistan in the last almost 20 years, if each year would you be willing to write a check for $1,352.94? $1,352.94. Every year, you're writing a check for that so that this war in Afghanistan can be continued. And you write that check every year for 17 years plus. Actually, more like 18 or 19 now. Would you be satisfied with the result? Would you keep writing the check if you had a choice? Would you be willing to hear alternatives at that point? And these costs are hidden from us. It's hidden because of tract of time, and also because it's not always just in direct taxes. There is the direct income tax, but there's also debt, which American debt is now, I believe, $23 trillion, which means that we are headed toward a national and global financial collapse that will make our money worthless. And if you think this is for our security or whatever the case may be, one of the things that's going to be the most detrimental to American security is our own debt. That's going our own self-inflicted wound, or really our government-inflicted wound, that both sides agree on more spending, whether they be on the left or the right, with some notable exceptions, I'll admit. That is how wars are paid for, or through the manipulation of the money supply. by a central bank like the Federal Reserve, that we just print more money into the economy and the government gets to use it first, and the money is not tied to any standard. And when we print money, when I take my $20 bills and put them on the copy machine and make a bunch of copies, that's a crime called counterfeiting. I'm committing theft through fraud. But when government does it, it's just called monetary policy. But it's the same effect remains. It doesn't matter if a government does it or an individual or some other entity. The same effect of inflation remains, where the money is then used to spend on wars and spent by government and spent by those at the top who get the money first. But there's not added value in the economy. And so the money becomes watered down. It becomes worth less and less and less. And then people receiving that money start realizing there's more of it. People are buying more of this. We need to raise prices. So people think inflation means the rising prices. It actually means a distortion of and watering down first of the money that then causes rising prices. Then the people at the bottom are affected most. Middle America, people in general are affected most because they have a dollar that is now worth less than it originally was, doesn't buy as much, and they deal with higher prices. You have just been taxed by inflation, by the Federal Reserve, without even knowing it, without even voting for a representative to do anything about it, without even knowing that there's a tax there. And so there's taxes, and then two prongs of taxes: debt, which is a tax of the future, tax of the unborn, a tax in the short term, a tax against the future, or printing and inflation, which is a hidden tax against the money itself, which is unsound and dishonest money. Imagine what you could do over the last 18 years or so with another $1,352. And if you knew that that was what you were paying and you were willing to pay it each year for the Afghanistan war and other American wars, would you not watch those wars more closely and be more critical of seeing what goals are being achieved? Are the stated objectives being met? Is Iraq now a thriving democracy? Is Afghanistan? Has rule of law taken place? The better treatment of its citizens? The better treatment of women? Capitalism? Free trade? A constitutional republic? Are there less terrorists in the world? In, I believe it was 2001, there were about 300 or 400 members of Al-Qaeda. Today, there are over 20,000 in the Middle East and other places around the world. And so if the goal of the terror wars was to destroy and eradicate terrorism, then it has failed by objective standard. Same for Iraq. It was a great boon to Al-Qaeda, by the way, in Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein, which allowed Al-Qaeda to gain a foothold in Iraq, as well as the Islamic State in Iraq. Same thing with Afghanistan, that this was a war that Osama bin Laden wanted America to fight, believing it would drain America economically and lead them to collapse, as happened with the Soviet Union after it invaded Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. It is now the longest war in American history. And Osama bin Laden's dead. And there's not a lot of evidence that there's a lot of Al Qaeda in Afghanistan anymore. And so these war costs, just in terms of cost benefit analysis, would you sit down and write a check to purchase the results that we have gotten over the last 18 years in Afghanistan? Not only the war is put in terms, but just in those economic terms. Has it achieved, have you gotten your money's worth? James Madison says, of all the enemies of public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. He says, war is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. In war, too, the discretionary power of the executive, that's the president, is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, emoluments is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the mind are added to those of subduing the force of the people. The same malignant aspect in malignant aspect in republicanism may be traced in the inequality of fortunes and the opportunities of fraud growing out of the state of war, and in degeneracy of manners and of morals engendered by both. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. And if Madison is right, and no nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare, we ought to seriously question the fact that America has been at war in the longest war of American history in Afghanistan from 2001 to now, present day 2019, including many other wars interspersing that time and many other going on even right now, including Yemen, and now they're discussing Iran. And so not only is this dangerous to your money, which is part of your freedom, this is dangerous to your liberty, according to Madison. Maybe Madison's wrong. Maybe continual warfare is just part of what it takes to be a modern nation state like the United States is today in a unipolar world. But the US has no enemy on the size and scale of the Soviet Union. Yet the Soviet Union collapsed, and military spending that dwarfs the rest of the world, many of whom include our allies, has continued to increase. Therefore, the wars have continued to increase as well as government power, as well as government surveillance, as well as government interference, both at home and abroad, other interventions, as well as the power of the presidency and the CIA. For all these wars that were never declared by Congress, according to the constitutional method, declaring a war and separating out those powers, that the last constitutionally declared war was World War II, and we've only had 5 total constitutionally declared wars. So is this worth the 23,000 that each of the taxpayers has spent? Uh, would it be worth it to spend the 1352 a year to write out that check for the results that we've gotten in Afghanistan? That's the question that we should be asking ourselves, one of the questions as we evaluate American foreign policy, especially with regard to Afghanistan.